Hello, everyone. I'm John Evans. Welcome to another episode of One on One. Ben David has stared hardened criminals in the eye. He's sent people to death row for their crimes. He's argued on behalf of crime victims for more than a decade. He's also a leader in his church. He's also a scout leader. And he also takes time to read children's books to elementary school students. One of two identical twins who have put down roots in southeastern North Carolina, Ben David won his first election for district attorney by less than 2,000 votes. He's been reelected now 3 times, all while running unopposed. Not sure as a child he knew he wanted to do law for a profession, but apparently some people in his community thought it was a possibility. That's just one of the things we learned talking to District Attorney Ben David. What kind of young man was Ben David growing up in Gainesville, Florida?
I think that depends who you ask, John. If you talk to my brother, he would tell you that we argued a lot. In fact, people called us the little lawyers starting at 7. If you talk to my parents, I think they would tell you that we were always outside, and until the sun went down, we were probably running around somewhere. If you asked my teachers, they would tell you I was a kid who loved school and sports and tried to do the right thing, but like the kids I talk to now, I've messed up a few times. When I got a little older, I loved surfing, and it was actually my love of the beach that ultimately drove me to Wilmington when I finally arrived in North Carolina. If Winston-Salem still had a beach, I would be there, but it doesn't. Mm-hmm. And so after Wake Forest there and the first few years of practice, I knew I had to get back to the water, and like a lot of people probably listening and watching, this is the best place to live in America. So that's why I came.
Obviously, growing up in Gainesville, because I worked in that market for a while.
I saw you when you were at University of Florida, John. I said, this guy's following me.
Yeah, but obviously, you grew up a Gator fan. You can't not grow up a Gator fan.
Every man and woman in my family, with the exception of my dad, and we're talking about extended family too, has been a Gator. I went to the University of Florida. Right. Even though I grew up in Gainesville, I decided to stay at home. Very fortunate to get a scholarship to attend. I loved Gainesville, and I'm still a big Gator.
And then what took you to Wake Forest?
It was a school. I mean, it's a great school. Mm-hmm. And I was told you should go to the best school you get into. My mom had moved up to Durham to return to where she went to school, which was Duke, when I was a freshman in college. And I would come up and visit her and saw what a beautiful place this was and said, man, I got to apply to a couple of schools there. And mm-hmm. I wasn't smart enough to get into Duke. And true story about Wake Forest. I was down in Florida. I got in last person off the waiting list into Wake. Wow. This was 3 nights before the start of school. I was down in Miami at the time. I got in a car and started driving. I got onto I-95, and then I saw signs for Wake Forest and pulled off, was looking everywhere, couldn't find it. Went into a restaurant and said, where's the school? And they said, you're in the town of Wake Forest. It's 2.5 hours that way. I was going to say,
that you saw the town.
That's the true story.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how much I knew about Wake Forest before I went, except that it had a great reputation and one of the best decisions I ever made.
Was there an incident or was there something? I mean, you said they called us the little lawyers, but what drove you to the law at an early? Did you know? Were you one of those exceptions to the rule like I am? I knew I wanted to talk for a living at 15. Did you know that you wanted to do law?
No, I did not. In fact, I frequently tell not only my children, but other children who I get a chance to talk to, if you don't have it figured out yet, stand in line, because most of us didn't, and we're still figuring it out. I was actually in pre-med at University of Florida and working in a hospital and all set to go there, and it was miserable. I even though I liked science as a class, the actual hospital environment was not something I wanted to do for 80 hours a week the rest of my life. I admire doctors and nurses. Our mom's one. And so there's no question that that's a great place to be, but it wasn't for me. My brother was pre-law at FSU, which we could have a long story about too.
Boy, oh boy.
Well, yeah, it's my mom. Our mom sits between. Yes, he's a traitor. Our parents had to sit between us during the Thanksgiving holiday, because that's when FSU plays Florida. But it was John who talked me in, not only to being a lawyer, because he said, Ben, I think you need to go to law school. That's what I'm going to do. And it was a recession back in 1992, you might remember, and a lot of people were riding out their time in graduate schools. But he's also the one who eventually talked me into leaving a lucrative practice where I was working to go be a public servant, because he was a prosecutor down in Miami when I was working at that big firm. So I give my brother a lot of credit for what I'm doing right now, not just in the practice of law, but being a DA.
Now, you're in private practice for several years before you get into that side that you were just talking
Right.
about, the prosecutor. Did you enjoy the private practice, or did you always, once you got out of law school, want to do the prosecutorial side?
No, I didn't always want to do the prosecutorial side. I loved law school. I'm one of those nerds who actually liked law school, and I loved working with really smart people. Doing intellectual property is what we were doing for a mega firm as the largest in the state. The money was great. I mean, in today's dollars, $135,000 a year for a 25-year-old.
Wow.
My prosecutors start at $40,000. So it was really easy to knock out all my student loans, which I was able to do in the first 2 years of being there. I am still attracted to people who work hard and who are really smart. And now that I get to hire people, that's who I look for. A lot of the things I've learned about how detailed you have to be and how the devil's in those details, and starting with the facts and not theories, and the importance of documenting it or it doesn't exist, that was beaten into me over 3 years of those 80-hour weeks at the firm, and I'm eternally grateful for that experience.
And then did you arrive first here, or did your brother arrive?
I did.
You arrived here first.
I came here the day after Columbine.
Right, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about. That was your first day as a prosecutor.
That was
right?
my first day. And you might remember this, John, because I know you were in the community at the time, but one of my very first experiences, and this was April of '99, was that week following, everyone's on edge.
Right.
And there was a bomb threat at Hoggart High School.
That's what I was going to ask you about. And they wrote on the walls there, right?
They did. The end is near, is what they wrote. And we had conduct that showed that they meant to cause pandemonium and panic, and they did. There was over 500 kids who checked themselves out of school. We had bomb sweeping units and dogs and everything else in the days that followed. And here come in these two kids, 16 and 17 years old, Josh and Gail. I'll never forget them. And as they're in these shackles, because they were shackled, and jumpsuits, I thought to myself a couple of things. First, they probably didn't realize that a prank like that could wind up like this. And how important it is to use our power gracefully. You know, to say, okay, school safety is obviously the number one thing that most people were focusing on then, and that's still a huge focus. We also have to have an adult conversation with our kids about choices and consequences. So a couple of things came out of that. First of all, I tried both of them. Gail got convicted in district court, and so did Josh. Josh appealed to Superior Court, where we had a jury trial, and that was my first jury trial as a prosecutor. I had had some as a private attorney. He was convicted. It went up to the Court of Appeals, where it was actually reversed because they said the threat was too vague, that maybe he was talking about the end of the millennium or talking about the end of the school year. I didn't buy that, but it also showed me the importance of, man, you got to actually follow your cases, even though they go into the Attorney General's office, follow them all the way up if they're going to become precedent. But I also turned to my boss at the time, John Carricker, and said, we need to start teen court because we want to have these kids learn about the court system through participating in it. And so he thought that was a great idea. And so he asked me to set up a teen court in Pender County, which is where he sent me to work on a murder case, while he had another prosecutor setting up the teen court in New Hanover. And that's still going strong 17, 18 years later.
Yeah, that spawned, I mean, and you have since talked about because they were tried as adults at 16 and 17.
They were.
So you have really gone on then to become a forebearer in the age of the young people who go to court and whether they need to be tried as adults.
I actually advocate for raising the juvenile age to 18. We are one of 2 states left where it's still 16 and you're an adult, which means it's on your permanent record. You go to the real jail, and there's a lot of consequences. You can't get federal student loans if you get a felony. Your average future earning potential goes down 40%. You can't get into federal assisted housing anymore. Most of us would agree that for nonviolent offenders, for young and dumb type things, we want to have some second chances. We've done a lot on the local level since the time I've been DA, and I give a lot of credit to the judges, defense attorneys, and courts clerks in the system. We've diverted more cases out of juvenile justice into teen court than anywhere else in the state. We have cut our caseload almost in half just with the school to prison pipeline initiative that Jay Corpening, our chief district court judge, instituted last year, that's now going to be the model for the state, because what we're anticipating is thousands of cases coming into the juvenile justice system if this age is raised to 17 and 18-year-olds. The one thing I'd say is, if we're going to raise it, we need to adequately fund the system. We need to make sure that other laws, like when do you get to start driving, when are you allowed to consent to sexual activity or embezzle from your employer, and when are you allowed to drop out of high school, because right now it's 16. I say we need to take a thoughtful look at making sure we graduate some responsibility there too. If we do those things, I think everyone in the court system would say, let's raise this tomorrow.
And full disclosure, I've talked about this, and many people know my wife Sheila has run the teen court program in New Hanover County and in Pender for several years.
Does a great job, John.
But I know that young men and women have come back to her who have been in it and who were offenders and have come back, and several of them are attorneys now who have helped her as judges. So
I've hired a couple.
Have you seen some of those come through?
Absolutely, and that's one of the great joys for me now. I mean, when I walk into a courtroom and someone says, I remember you from teen court or from talking in my school, that's a great thing. And the thing about teen court is the rate of recidivism is much lower. Just to be clear on this program, the only adult in the entire process is the judge. Everyone else, from the prosecutor to the defense attorney, clerk, bailiff, the jury, they're all teenagers. You have to plead guilty to even get into it. We're talking about first-time offenders, nonviolent. They're going to listen more to their peers than to us right now when they're 15 years old. And what we know is, if they're accepting responsibility, this hearing really becomes a de facto sentencing hearing. What should happen? And when it comes from their peer group of, hey, you need to do 100 hours of community service, you need to write a letter of apology, you need to make restitution, that has more effect to have a full-blown trial than a 5-minute plea in front of a district court judge. That's a program that works, and it's spread like kudzu around the state.
What does it say? I mean, when you became a prosecutor in '99, and then Mr. Carricker steps down, and in '04, you really have to start selling yourself to be the DA. Is that when politics may have gotten involved? I mean, were you aware of, you got to be elected to be a DA? Were you aware of the politics before that?
So my wife was pregnant. I was in a capital murder trial. Mr. Carricker came into my office and said, there's been 4 DAs in 50 years. Ben, I'm about to walk outside and say I'm retiring in a month. I think you should be the next DA. And keep in mind, at that moment, there were people in the office who had been there for 30 years as prosecutors, great mentors of mine. And I said, why me? And that's a moment. And he said, you can win. And he said, and the thing is, I can't hand this office to you. You've got to go out and earn it. This is not an appointment position. There's going to be an election. You've got it to go out there and do it. I've been watching you for 5 years. I'm going to suggest to the office, everyone stand down and support you. And that was a tough thing. And there was a couple of reasons. First, I have an identical twin brother who was a prosecutor in the office at the time, and he lived on the other side of the bridge, so he wasn't even eligible to run. And so the thought of being his boss all of a sudden was kind of uncomfortable. But also, it's an overwhelming amount of responsibility.
Sure.
I obviously decided to say yes. And, a lot happened. Over that next 4 months, my wife gave birth, the guy got the death penalty, and I won the election, all in the space of 1 week of each other.
Wow.
That all happened in September of 2004 in the special primary where 4 of us ran for that office.
I was going to say, it was pretty close, too. And the election afterwards was 51-49.
It was. In fact, you probably have some old footage of this, and I have yet to see it, but I'm told that it's kind of the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat moment. We didn't know till about midnight that I had won that election, because there was some ballots that needed to come in from Surf City and Topsail up in Pender. And it was so close we had to wait for that precinct to report. And I had already told my supporters, we were all massed at the Hilton downtown Wilmington, go home, we're not going to know. And then it came in. And you guys actually apparently caught it on camera that I had become the district attorney. And that was an incredible feeling. And you know what? I still have that feeling this many years later. I still love what I do, and I feel really blessed to get to work with who I do.
What's it like, though, to ask somebody to support you? Because you've run, and you've run unopposed the last 3 times. After that first one in 2004, 2006, 10, and 14, you've been unopposed.
Right.
But what is it like to ask somebody to give their most precious commodity, their vote and their faith and their support to you?
It's a humbling experience, first of all, and it's something that you have to learn how to do. And frankly, nothing prepares you for it. Not public speaking, not jury trials. To really have to meet someone and hear them before you talk to them, to really find out what the issues are in their life, and to give people confidence that if something happened to their loved one, would they want me to show up to the scene, advise local law enforcement, and then go speak for them in a jury trial, and to lead the largest law firm, to advise 1,000 officers in 20 different police agencies, to effectively be in charge of 75,000 cases a year. That's a lot to ask of anybody, and I had to grow into the role. And it's something that, as these elections have progressed, I've been very fortunate to get to focus on running the office instead of running for office. Let me be clear on this. I don't take it for granted, and I'm always out there. John, you know this. I never stop being out in the community. My philosophy is, instead of spending money on bumper stickers or signs, you don't see that. I'm in a lot of different places to be accountable to the community I serve. And so, speaking to 10,000 school kids a year, going to a lot of different graduations of officers, for instance, working with all the outreach things that we've created through the years. That's not because it's an extracurricular activity. I believe that's in the DNA of our office. If you're going to represent a community, you have to be out in the community, listening to them, and also setting the tone for what it means to truly do justice.
Now, let me ask you this, because I want to know how you do it, because it's a balancing act. You've got a family, you've got a wife, you've got 3 children.
Right.
How do you balance the need to be out there in the community to making sure that you have that family time with Stephanie and the kids? That's
a great question. Well, first of all, I have a very understanding family. I like to think that we do find that balance at home. I'm a soccer coach. I hang out at the beach with them too. We're together for dinner just about every night. I really try to guard my time when it's off the clock in terms of the traditional times. I used to say yes to many more things than I do now. And what I've said is, I can't wait to show up at whatever event we can talk about. Can we do it sometime during the day, not on a weekend? Every now and then I'll have to cut into that family time. But what I've found is that most people, when you tell them that, they say, yeah, we'll make that work. And so I also have an incredible staff of 45 people, and I give them the opportunities to do these things. Like when I was speaking this morning at a school, I brought one of my prosecutors with me to say, tell them about, it was teen court, it was Erica. And, what I'm trying to do is give them a voice too, and have the force multiplier of 4 dozen of us out there, not just Ben David. What you've seen press releases we put out, and one thing I'm really careful to do is say, I don't want to be the name, the picture on this thing. I want the mugshot of the defendant who just was found guilty or pled guilty, and I want a quote not from me but by the prosecutor or victim witness assistant who's handling that case. So spreading that out a little bit helps me have the balance at home. And marrying well and having great kids really helps too.
Do the kids know the gravity of your office? I know obviously Stephanie knows, but I mean, do your kids know what Dad does?
They're learning. But right now they're 12, 11, and 8. And they're all at Gregory, and the oldest one also goes to Williston for half the day. And they have friends who say, I saw your dad on TV, or your dad prosecuted my uncle, or things like that. And so they're getting an inkling. And also wherever we go, John, just as I'm sure happens with you, you'll be out at a restaurant or in a grocery store and someone needs 5 minutes, right?
Sure.
They've had that their whole lives. Because literally, Maddie was born 2 days after I won the primary and was 6 weeks old when we won the general election. And so she's never known anything else, and neither have Sophie or Fitz.
Yeah, so it's got to be, because you have to have those priorities.
Yeah, that's right.
And as they grow.
That's right. And I take them along for this adventure. I mean, some of the things that we are called to do, like had a great event last week where we're raising money and awareness about puppy mills, and to say we need to end this. And animal cruelty. And there was something that my brother and I were asked to host called Canines and Couture, where it was dogs walking the catwalk. And that's a fun night. And there was a lot of kids. There's models that are, walking with dogs. And all three of my kids are in the front row. So I like to think they get to see more of the community than maybe I would be able to show them if I was in private practice, because to be clear, the DA sees everything. I am in a $1 million home in Wrightsville Beach one day, and then in Section 8 public housing standing over a murder scene the next. And what I try to do when I see these tragedies, when I see the recurrent themes that bring people into the justice system, is say, how can we break this cycle? How can we bring awareness to this issue? How can we go upstream to some of the root causes that are causing these ripple effects of these, these waves of consequences? And, when it occurs, between 5:30 and the rest of the night or over the weekend, I'll try and bring Steffi and the kids with me if I can.
How do you, or can you, get hardened after so many years? Because I imagine, you've seen countless victims and you've worked countless cases, but does there still need to be a humanity to every case, or do you get hardened after 15 years?
You have to check yourself on that, John. You can get cynical if you're not careful. It's really important with the stress that comes with this job to have an outlet, and again, to surround yourself with really good people. Within our office, I like to rotate people in and out of things like sexual abuse involving children or domestic violence, because those are really heavy caseloads. It is important to have friends outside of the law who hopefully keep you grounded and get you talking about things that have nothing to do with the job. I feel very blessed to have an incredible family who keeps me grounded and who reminds me where I came from. The neat part for me, this deep into my career, is that I'm still young enough where I feel like I can get out there and be vital for some of these kids I talk to and for some of the people that, frankly, are in the adult, courts and juvenile courts. But I'm also advanced enough in how many things I've seen after 18 years of being a prosecutor that I know some of the trends. And the focus on those things, the outreach efforts we can do, I really believe much of our crime we see is preventable. Focusing on those things actually brings hope, and that's what keeps me going. If it was just about responding to the latest tragedy rather than being proactive, I think you can burn out quicker with that. If you embrace this community-based prosecution model, I think it's a whole lot more fun and more effective.
Worst day as a prosecutor?
Boy, that's a tough question. I've walked into some crime scenes that have haunted me, that I still think about. 14-year-old kid who's overdosed, or having to do a death notification of a family that I know. I would put those up there. Having to prosecute people who I admire. I've had to put officers of the law in front of grand juries before. That's really tough, John. I mean, make no mistake about it. We have to be independent. There's an oath here, but there's also a human component. There's good people who sometimes mess up. That's really tough also. If I had to isolate it to one day that's the toughest, boy, I would say, and I don't want to name the case out of respect for the family, but there was a heartbreaking case that I walked into a crime scene on, and I knew that the dad was out there and didn't know what had happened yet. And just seeing that, I saw someone's heartbreaking in front of me. And, what's tough about that as a prosecutor is I'm going to get to know his daughter really well. I'm going to speak for her in a courtroom. But there's nothing I can do, even the death penalty, that's going to bring that girl back. And that's a tough thing to have to confront, that while we try to make people as whole as possible by giving them money or giving someone who hurt them incarceration, there's some things that you just can't make whole ever again. And I would say that case was one of the first experiences I had, and I've had many, where you kind of see that and you're like, this is just not okay.
What's the best thing you learned from your best boss?
Wow. Well, I don't know who my best boss is.
I mean, Stephanie aside, because I know that she's the boss, but
I'll start with a guy named Ralph Stockton. The largest law firm in North Carolina, and it's got 450 lawyers. Kilpatrick Stockton. It was named for him. My grandmother died. She died when I was, I think, a second-year associate at that big firm. And unbeknownst to me, he sent my family flowers. And that meant a whole lot to my family. And I remember my mom saying, "You should work for that man because he's just a decent person." And I remember what he said to me when I was and he looked like Colonel Sanders from Kentucky Fried Chicken, and he was a multimillionaire. He had a house at Figure 8, and he lived in Winston-Salem. But, he said, "Ben, there's only a couple of things that'll get you fired here. And one is being unkind to my secretary. And another thing is I expect you to answer your own phone because I do." And then he had me write down my name on a piece of paper. And he said, "Take a good look." He said, "That's all you've got." He said, "As a lawyer, that's your only asset. Your name is your only asset." It's like, what do you want people to think about when they hear your name? And if you work on that right now as a young attorney, then it's going to continue to grow. And people will respect that name more. But if you do anything to violate it, if you tell an untruth in a courtroom to win that one case, if you get people to perjure testimony or do anything else, then this mahogany desk, this glass office that looks over a skyline, it all means nothing. You'll have lost everything. And I really needed to hear that from a guy who I admired when I was 26, 27. And I share that with a lot of my other prosecutors and victim witness legal assistants to this day.
Nice. You have, what I just learned, you have required reading.
Yes.
For everybody that comes into your office.
That's right.
What is it and why?
Well, there's a few books that I love to pass around. One is, we started the Harlem Children's Zone in Wilmington a few years ago, and it's now called the Youth Enrichment Zone. You've heard about reopening DC Virgo, where Michael Jordan was a middle school student, and all of the criminal elements that are there and how we reduce crime by 30%. That was based on Jeffrey Canada's model out of Harlem, New York. And his book, Fight, Stick, Knife, I believe is his book. But then also another book that I wanted everybody to read was about an intervention-based strategy where you can call gang members in and say, "We've got you on film fighting with each other or dealing drugs. We could play that tape, have trial by Samsung, and convict you tonight, and you're on your third strike, so it's a long boat. We're going to leave you out. We're going to leave you out because there's someone else to fill the vacuum if you get arrested tonight, and that's your baby brother or cousin. And so we're going to give you an opportunity to get a job. The street's not the only equal opportunity employer. We're going to have others. We're going to have a community college, get your GED." It sounds too good to be true. It comes from a book called Don't Shoot by David Kennedy. And the average community that does this sees a dramatic decrease in youth violence, gang violence, the shootings, the open-air drug markets that you see. I had every one of my employees read that. And it also, it bridges the divide between the real third-rail issue of race and justice. There's a misconception. The longer you work in the criminal justice system, I think the more open to humanity you become. What you see is the biggest victims of crime look a lot like the biggest defendants. And so go to any jail in America. Here in New Hanover County, 54% is African American, 18% of the overall population. Does that mean we're profiling? Before you answer that question, consider that since I've been district attorney, in the 12 years I've been DA, 81% of the murder victims have been African American and poor. And so that's called the mirror image rule. Hold up a mirror to who's in that jail, and that's what their victims look like. And so when you start to see these bigger things, when you realize that there's nothing new under the sun, and what we're seeing in Wilmington has probably happened in New York or California or Utah, it's important to stay well read on that. And there's many books I could point to, John, that I encourage people to read. I like to stay abreast of it too.
Yeah. Who's a better golfer, you or your brother?
John, much. Because my children are 6 years older, and I became the DA 6 years earlier.
Right.
And so he's had a 6-year head start on me because I've never met a dad of the year who's golfer of the year or vice versa. Right. And if you're too good at golf, you're not a very good prosecutor.
Yeah. But what's it like to have an identical twin brother? You think alike? Do you have that inner workings of the mind?
First of all, John is my best friend, and he's an idol of mine. I really admire John. And I don't say that just because he's a great trial lawyer, and he is. I don't say that because he's the best-looking prosecutor in the state.
Or the fact that we hope he downloads this at some point in time.
I say that because, John had to be the first assistant in my office for 6 years running the violent crime unit before he got the chance to win his own election and do what he does now. And that required him to be the better man. For 6 years he walked around to hear, are you Ben or his brother? And now, when we walk around, it's which one are you? That's a tough transition for 6 years, and I admire him for that. John is running a great office, by the way. He's here's my problem. If it's a problem, it's a beautiful problem to have. No one wants to leave my office now. That we have over 200 years worth of prosecutors among those 20 attorneys. And because of that, we're really top-heavy. There's not a lot of movement. And so I'll get 100 resumes every time there's an opening. And what these kids who are graduating from law schools don't realize is you can still live here and you can work 20 minutes away in Bolivia or just a little further away in Columbus or Bladen, just as you can go up to Onslow County, where I've hired a couple of them from them. And so there's a lot of people, when they're young, they want to live in either Raleigh or Charlotte or Asheville or Wilmington, right? But there's 40 other districts. There's 40 other district attorneys who offer you not only great opportunities, but have some really good prosecutors in there where you're going to be a great attorney. And so John has been able to hire many former interns, many people from this local market, and they're doing great things over on that side of the bridge.
Do you finish each other's sentences, though? Is there anything to that of being an identical twin?
John and I not only shared a room all growing up, but, we spent 13 years apart from each other. The 4 years of college, 3 years of law school, and then the first 5 years of practice. When we ultimately got back together, it was like a homecoming. There's no question we have a language between us. We have an unstated understanding of what's really going on. But I think it's easy for people to look at us and say they're the same. We're actually much different. And even though we do the same things, I know people say, well, Ben's an elected Democrat and John's an elected Republican, and that's true. We're really a whole lot different. And
one's a Gator, one's a Seminole.
Well, there you have it. That's even worse than being a Republican or Democrat divide.
It's got to be at least at Thanksgiving dinner. It's got to be that way.
It definitely is.
Okay. Last question for you. There have been talk, and I have even asked you this question, but as you look forward, where do you see yourself in 5, 10, 15 years? Are you still a district attorney? Is there any yearn for higher office at any point?
That's a great question, and I'm flattered when people ask me that or suggest it to me, because I think they're saying to me, you need to do something else eventually.
But you've taken leadership roles here in this community, and you have done a lot in this community that you see people with that kind of vision. And I've told you this privately, so I'm not telling you anything that I haven't. But I think that you've got a bigger vision than this area. And does that run through your mind at all?
Yes. The short answer is it does. Having said that, when Maddie was born, which was in 2004, and that's when I won the election, I don't know if you remember, but you can go back to the tape and see it, John. I said I want to be the DA for 20 years. And I said that because I wanted to raise my children in Wilmington. I've had other opportunities, John. I've had people call me to say run for this or be appointed to that and move to some other community. And what I always tell them is no. No, because I love this place. This is where Stephanie and I call home. But it's also a great lifestyle that allows me to raise these 3 children with my wife. And my whole family has since moved here. I'm kind of a family colonist. So you've got me for at least another 7 years.
Well,
and so I'll tell you that. After that, I'll hit judicial retirement where it doesn't make sense economically to stay. And I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but I'm not going to retire in 7 years. But I don't expect to be the DA after that time either.
Yeah, well, the community is better because you're here. And I know I speak for about 200,000 people in these two counties.
I feel the same. And John, I don't know where I'm moving next, but maybe it's wherever you move, because we've been in Florida together. We're here now.
Yeah.
So let me know where you're going next, because I keep watching you wherever I go.
I'll let you know. By the sounds of things, Ben David is going to be in this community for at least another 7 years. Don't be surprised if higher office comes calling once he's done arguing on behalf of crime victims in New Hanover and Pender counties. If you know someone you think would be a good interview for a future episode of One-on-One, send me an email, jevans@wect.com. You can also reach out to me on Twitter or Facebook. I'm on those two social media sites every day. I'm John Evans. Thanks for being with us for another episode of One-on-One.